Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gary Summers, and welcome to Mind, Body, Soul, a show about your mental, physical, and spiritual wellness. Well, this is kind of appropriate because, according to mental health professionals, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental condition that results in a series of emotional and physical reactions in individuals who have either witnessed or experienced a traumatic events that cause the individual to fear for personal life and well-being, such as a car collision or other accident, a physical or sexual assault, long-term abuse, torture, a natural disaster, living in a war zone, or life-altering experiences like the death of a loved one can all spur a variety of symptoms. My guest today is holistic psychotherapist Nancy Lieff, who has a graduate degree in mental health and addictions, a certified Canadian counselor, and a shamanic practitioner. Love to hear about that, which deals with how to get in touch with your purpose, probably lost through trauma. Nancy's going to help us make sense of this today. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Nancy, it's great to have you here. So Nancy, define PTSD, because I certainly know that people who have it certainly understand what it is. People who maybe see it don't really understand it and how to deal with it. So can you just kind of put it in a nutshell as to what post-traumatic stress disorder is?
Sure. It is a trauma and stressor related disorder classified in the DSM-5, so that's the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. The DSM-5 is the fifth edition of this book, and it came out in 2013. There were a lot of revisions to the DSM-5 description of PTSD this time around, because the understanding of trauma has really expanded. So that was wonderful. There are 8 criteria and 2 specifications in the DSM-5 that one would have to meet in order to satisfy
the official definition of PTSD.
Right. So now if you're just looking to say what PTSD is, just briefly.
Or did you want to go through those 8 criteria? Is that
Sure,
too much?
sure. That's not too much. No,
Sure,
that's fine.
sure.
Yeah. So
Because sometimes people don't even realize they have it, right?
exactly.
Right. So it's a simple thing of ticking off the boxes.
Exactly. And talking about the criteria here in this kind of format is a lot different than just looking at the list of
Sure,
symptoms in the
sure.
book, right? So
Yeah.
absolutely. So criteria A is the stressor. So the biggest change in the DSM-5 with this piece is that you no longer have to directly experience the traumatic event or the stressor. You can indirectly experience the stressor. So some common stressors that people may, commonly understand to be related to PTSD would be the stuff that you talked about on the introduction.
Sure. Yeah.
Living in a war zone, experiencing sexual abuse or torture, or being in a car accident. So those definitely are included. But they're also the threat or the actual experience of death. I suppose if you've passed away,
Sure.
you can't have PTSD,
Sure.
but you can have a near-death experience,
Sure.
right? Or so that would classify.
Nancy, would the diagnosis of a terminal illness fall into this category as well?
Absolutely, for sure, because everybody's going to respond to that differently, right? So they're living in that time period, just knowing that this is coming, right? So that can totally, set off the onset of these symptoms, which we'll get into. So yes, threat or actual death, near death, serious injury, sexual violence, like you mentioned. Or even just being exposed directly or indirectly to adverse details of traumatic events or incidents. So we're talking about EMS, paramedic, police, ambulance. These types of professionals who are in the field. I actually know somebody who has been diagnosed with PTSD from doing work as a paramedic, and so you can be exposed to that or indirectly exposed to the threats. So the big thing that a lot of people don't realize about this criteria is that you can have PTSD from learning that somebody that you love or are related to almost died, has a terminal illness, was sexually abused. You don't have to actually experience it. You can experience the threat
because
of it.
your mind can play havoc with your mental health, right?
Absolutely.
And you can start running through, I guess, what if that had happened to me? How would I deal with things like that, right?
Yeah, and it sets off that reactive responses in the body from the mind. So as I'm going to be talking about PTSD throughout the show, one thing that I'd like to keep reiterating to listeners is that PTSD is largely the reaction to the indirect or direct threat or the actual stressor.
Because
series of reactions.
Two people could experience the same thing. One person gets PTSD, one person doesn't.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. But yeah, trauma is common. Trauma is every day. There's everyday kinds of traumas, and everybody in life goes through something traumatic, in my view. But not everybody develops PTSD.
Right. So we did a show a while ago on cognitive behavioral therapy, and what CBT tells us is that it's not the action, but it's the belief that creates what the consequence is of that. So PTSD is kind of similar in a way. Like, it's not everybody who experiences trauma gets PTSD.
Absolutely. And yeah, the mind is a very powerful force, one part of the puzzle of what feeds the reaction, the reactionary responses to PTSD, along with emotions. The physical body is a huge role, which we'll get into, and even on a spiritual level as well, which we'll get into. So that's the criteria A.
Nancy, so that's one tick on the box. What are the other criteria that would determine for someone to have PTSD?
And here's the symptoms is criteria B, and the symptoms are called intrusion symptoms. So they're like intruders. They come when you least expect it. Sometimes they come when you expect it if you have an external or internal reminder of the stressor.
So you talk of their triggers.
Yeah, triggers, absolutely. So when someone is experiencing a trigger or the threat of a trigger, because it even goes like that, they may be experiencing unwanted, upsetting memories. Nightmares are common. Flashbacks, where you believe that you are re-experiencing the event, even if you can see that the event is not happening in front of your eyes. Your body's in that reaction mode. Flashbacks can be anywhere from a few seconds to, sometimes I've known people to have flashbacks and to relive the actual experience emotionally, psychologically, physically, spiritually for 2 to 3 days, weeks, months, depending on the severity of the trigger and how close it mimicked the trauma. So that's some emotional distress after exposure to traumatic reminders, and the physical reactivity after exposure to the reminders.
Listeners need to understand that our brain doesn't know the difference between what happens inside of it and what happens outside of it. And
Absolutely.
even though the trauma happened many, many years ago, when you experience that trigger, you're actually reliving it as if it's happening all over again.
Your body does not forget.
You're right.
Your body knows and remembers, and your mind can't keep up with the body. Your body can't discern.
Yeah.
It does. Another thing about feature, and this really speaks to the criteria B, the intrusion symptoms that a lot of people sort of miss, is that trauma doesn't have time. There's no such thing. Your body is always open to re-experiencing that until the transformation has occurred, and you're able to re-experience a trigger in a less distressing way. But trauma has no time.
That's a good point, Nancy, that trauma has no time limit. You know, this could go on for years and years, and for just someone to simply say, well, that happened years ago, just get over it, is really an unrealistic statement, isn't it?
Yeah, it has no time. And so that, when you think about intergenerational trauma, you think about childhood trauma, there's no such thing really as getting over it when you have PTSD.
degrees of seriousness?
So the degrees of seriousness, there is such thing as degrees of seriousness. There are a lot of factors that would make the PTSD for a person more severe. So, for example, if a person is a part of a marginalized population, so you're taking someone who might be indigenous, youth, someone who falls in the category of being elderly, women, people with disabilities of any sort. You've got your LGBTQ asterisks, demographic. All of these populations are already predisposed to ongoing re-victimization as it is, and also have experiences throughout life that might fuel this diagnosis. Someone who experiences poverty, for example, would be someone who may find that PTSD for them, depending on the severity of poverty and any other factor that makes them fall into that marginalized population spectrum, would play a hand. It also goes into, like, if you're working in a workplace that is toxic and has workplace bullying dynamics, school bullying, or PTSD rarely occurs in an isolated way. So there's comorbidity or co-occurring mental illnesses like depression, anxiety is very common. ADD can be very common with PTSD because the mind is constantly having a hard time focusing, and the cognitive impairments can make a person present as though they have PTSD. Lots of times it's ADHD, ADD.
Nancy, we talked about some of the leading causes and of PTSD, and so what is the leading cause? In doing my research, I read that sexual assault or sexual violence is certainly up there. Can you just speak to that issue?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it is. Sexual violence and the spectrum of what constitutes sexual violence, which, there's a lot of misconceptions about what that is. We can get into a whole show on that. But, absolutely, it is a misunderstood aspect of PTSD, just even in that way. And it's definitely a leading factor in the development of PTSD for people. All you need to do is tune into the news and just, hear, I think, former PC leader, Ronna Ambrose. She is right now lobbying for a program for judges to take to better understand sexual violence, and that's happening for a reason. As somebody who understands and has an in-depth understanding in PTSD, as I'm watching women on the stand or hearing about them testifying on their behalf about their experiences, the questions that I hear come from judges that make the news are just appalling, and they're not informed. You can tell. You wouldn't ask these questions. You would understand that trauma and something as severe as sexual violence for people impairs your cognition and your memory. And so there are details of a traumatic incident that, due to the intelligence of the body and the diagnosis itself, blocks out these key features so that you can carry on and survive the incident.
Well, your subconscious mind goes into protection mode, and that's why a lot of people, when they're in a horrific accident, they don't remember parts before, they don't remember parts after. So it's basically right, and it's a blocking mechanism to help in survival, really, isn't it?
It's functional.
I mean,
right?
if you've got to relive some of that stuff every single day of your life,
you
wouldn't make it, would you?
No, you would, especially with sexual violence. It is the most violating form of abuse. So for many people, sexual abuse is so adversive that it even affects postpartum populations. So even just the trauma of even just birthing, if you've been a victim of sexual violence, even just having a baby can not make you think that you're re-experiencing, like with your brain having thoughts that, oh, this reminds me of the incident, but your body remembers.
I had a young lady several months ago, and she was a victim of rape growing up, and she's married now, but she's having major issues
Absolutely.
with intimacy
Yeah.
with her husband now
Mhm.
because of this. She just can't get past those. And when
Mhm.
you kind of overgeneralize and when you apply that same thing to other men in your life, that I mean that's a very normal thing
Absolutely.
to do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you even look at the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue in Canada.
Those numbers are scary.
Yeah, very scary, and it speaks to the prevalence of sexual violence in Canada. We can speak to at least that, and the power and the need to have this issue understood in the justice system, in schools, in whatever system people are working in.
Well, Nancy, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day. Everybody, listeners, this is part one of part two. Nancy Lieff, psychotherapist, talking about PTSD symptoms, causes, and she'll be back next week to finish that off. Hello, everybody. I'm Gary Summers, and welcome to Mind, Body, Soul, a show about your mental, physical, and spiritual wellness. Last week, I spoke to psychotherapist Nancy Lieff, who gave us a very good, concise definition, symptoms, causes, stressors that lead to PTSD. And she's back again this week to finish off that talk. So Nancy, one of the issues that I hear a lot is I'd love to be able to see a psychotherapist or a psychologist, but I just can't afford it. Are there any other options besides seeking professional help for people dealing with PTSD?
Yes, absolutely. Now, being sensitive to knowing that PTSD itself affects people differently, that group attending groups and stuff like that might be hard for people with PTSD.
Well, I think sometimes people just can't even leave their house.
Yes, they can develop other types of anxiety disorders, such as agoraphobia or the fear of leaving one's home.
Right.
With the fear that something bad may happen to them.
Yeah.
Right. So that's that hold that the fear aspect has from the trauma. But groups and just attending personal development groups or anxiety, depression groups, PTSD groups. I know there's a PTSD buddies group in town.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
You were sharing with me. Those types of things. The power of groups is monumental for people to just connect with, because one of the symptoms that frequently shows up is isolation, feeling isolated. Like you just don't belong. Because there's this belief
You feel that there's something wrong with you.
that there's something wrong with you and that you are just tainted by the experience, which is not true, but this is the belief, right? So it can isolate people.
I'd like listeners to understand one thing before we go further. And when I talk to people when they come to see me, the first question I ask them, and it's not necessarily PTSD, sometimes it is, sometimes something else. I'll ask them, do you feel there's something wrong with you? And invariably everybody says yes. And I say, well, I just want to reassure you right now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. Your brain is working exactly the way that it was designed to work. It's just working against you. You need to figure out how you can turn your brain around so that it can start to work for you. And that's what counseling, that's what you're here. You're here to help people to get them through that and get their brain functioning the way it was designed to function.
And brain meaning body as well.
Absolutely.
Right? And so not feeling like you're out of control or helpless to the reactions in your body and how that affects your mind. And really, when you work from a holistic level, attending to any other aspect of the trauma that has changed you. Because people who experience trauma feel like there's a piece of them missing. And they just can't put their finger on it. Usually, this is how it kind of comes up, and so it's a journey of helping people come home to themselves, so that they feel whole again. Because there's that aspect that was lost in the trauma,
And you brought up a really good point, saying that trauma has no time bounds. So people who are on this journey of wellness sometimes they may fall into the trap of, or people may say, well, that happened so many years ago, like, get over it. It's time for you now to move on with your life. So what do you say to people who feel like their journey has been too long?
Who, the client?
Yeah, the client who says, people are telling me I need to move
Yes.
past it, but everyone's journey is different, isn't it?
Absolutely, because everybody's experience of trauma is different. So what might feel like a traumatic event to one person might not feel like that to another person for many complex reasons. You take genetics, you take there's many reasons, predispositions, to mental illness and such. But everybody's journey is different. Transformation is possible. I've seen it with my own two eyes, and it's something that I'll never tire of. And there is power in that pain when you are able to harness it, unpack it, learn to live with it and tolerate it. It eventually, the power, the intensity of the triggers will lose the power over time, and a person may re-experience a trigger, but they still have control of their life that they didn't have before. So everybody's journey is different, and takes the people heal in their own time.
So, I guess the message here is to be gentle with yourself.
Absolutely.
Don't expect that your recovery is going to be the same as somebody else's recovery, but knowing that you're on that path to recovery is really what's most important, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Nancy, I introduced you as a shamanic practitioner, and for those people who don't know what it is, could you explain that? I know you use that as a complementary therapy for people suffering with PTSD.
Absolutely. So I was introduced to shamanism, 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, maybe a bit longer. And so it came after my formal training, both degrees. And, it was very interesting to me because from a very early stage in my training, I knew that healing was holistic. But I found personally, in my journey of becoming a psychotherapist, that traditional, conventional forms of therapy didn't really speak to that. So shamanism has been around for 40,000 years, before there was such thing as globalization and people knew that there were other people in the earth. So shamans were, your primitive doctors, healers, priests, everything. And so their way of healing people included healing people on a soul level. And so in my experience with trauma, PTSD, mental health, addictions, the whole gamut, there is an aspect of people that, when we're talking about soul, this is their purpose, this is their core being that they feel on their journey through mental health, they've lost touch with and they've disconnected with. And it's in my view that you don't need to experience trauma or mental health of any kind to be disconnected from your soul. I think that we live in a world that takes us away from all of that. So, but there is a way to help people heal in mental health and addictions, specifically with PTSD, to access that part of self that was lost during the original trauma, and the soul of that part, and help bring it home back to the present day.
Is that a form of talk therapy then, or
a little bit? I have to take off my counselor hat, my psychotherapist hat, a little bit. Shamanic work is very sacred, and it's a process that a person goes through with their soul and divine spirit, have you, whatever that means to somebody. You don't have to have a religious understanding or a non-orthodox understanding, so it's for anybody.
Nancy, so it helps in a way where conventional medicine can't. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. There are healing rituals as well. That you can do with people. You have to have specific training in that, and I think I'm on like 6 or 7 different trainings that I have, and so soul retrieval is one of them, bringing back that piece of the soul that was lost during the original trauma. Another piece which is very interesting with the intrusions, because intrusion symptoms is criteria B, like I mentioned previously in our interview, and the very understanding of shamanism and trauma is that, you know, the soul goes through a loss, and the person, when they're well, they are in balance. When they're not well, they're unbalanced. And in the spiritual body of a person, sometimes there is stuff that doesn't belong, you know, on a spiritual level, from trauma. And so there's an extraction process where a shamanic practitioner goes into shamanic state and removes the intrusion. So the language is just absolutely, it's eerie how complementary, you know, conventional and non-conventional aspects of working with PTSD can kind of present themselves.
So really what we're talking about here is getting people in touch with their purpose. And I always say, and like you said, it was a really good point, that you don't have to have trauma to lose your purpose. Mm-hmm. And so often I see people who just don't have a reason to get out of bed in the morning.
Absolutely, and there's depression right there.
And right there, right? You know, so it's nice to know what happens when PTSD goes untreated, or what happens when people think that they can do this on their own. Where does that lead people?
You know, what I commonly see is that it's a pattern of re-victimization. So, you know, people, you know, might get the sense that they're reliving the same situation time and time and again. You take abusive relationships, very, very common, very common. And so people will, you know, continue to find the same partner. And this all stems back, usually, from an original trauma. It could have been witnessing domestic violence as a child, or experiencing it themselves, or somewhere early on in relationships. Maybe they didn't have a background at all like that as a child in their family. Maybe they had an experience of abuse as outside the family domain, or witnessed it. And so that, you know, that's the blueprint. And so what I find is that without intervention, you know, we can't see outside ourselves. You know, someone might say, I like to kind of talk about trauma like this. Someone might think they have a handle on it, and I'll say to them, you know, well, here's the thing. If you're in a lion's belly and you've lived your whole life in a lion's belly, you know, how do you know you're in a lion's belly if you haven't been outside the lion's belly?
Yeah,
you know,
that's all you know.
Yeah, and so we're subjective. We don't have eyes to look at us all the time and to notice the subtleties of PTSD and the patterns, right? So, and that's part of denial as well.
So that's is that part of where you hear some people say, I always pick the wrong person?
Yeah, I would say in part that, you know, that plays a
that's
big
all you
factor.
Know?
Yeah, it does. You know, like I said, it's a blueprint that's set for an individual, and they learn how to relate to other people intimately. Keyword intimately. You know, through power imbalances, identifying as a victim or a perpetrator or both. You know, and that becomes what they've learned. And when you look at trauma and how it affects the mind, the body, the spirit, the emotions, you know, that's a conditioning. And so it can take time to decondition things. If it took 20 years or so to make those conditions happen, and your whole body and your whole being is involved in that conditioning, it can take time to unravel holistically the conditioning.
So here's the big question. How do people take their power back? Because that's really what this comes down to, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How is it to the point where you say, I've had enough? I deserve more out of life than this.
Well, you know, in a way, taking your power back involves accepting that living with PTSD or any mental health issue goes far beyond managing symptoms. Because I think a lot of us believe that, you know, we read pop culture, you just, there's all kinds of information out there on mental health and addictions. And everything is about coping. And coping is a huge part of it. But it's not everything. And that total transformation is possible. It requires, you know, embracing and embracing and accepting that reality. And it's a journey of reclaiming the pieces of yourselves that have been lost to trauma, right? And returning to wholeness. And trauma leaves a person feeling like some aspect of their self is missing after the trauma or a period of trauma that has changed them. It's a journey of returning to the bag, that long unconscious bag that we drag behind us, that's full of disowned aspects of ourselves that are lost, and slowly connecting, acknowledging, embracing, honoring, and transforming these pieces back into the conscious whole. It's a true transformative, holistic journey that requires more than managing symptoms with just techniques.
Nancy, great conversation, and we're out of time. We'd love to have you back to
Anytime.
talk about other stuff. And I know you've gotten a lot of interest, I'm sure, from listeners out there. How do people get in touch with you?
Oh, so yeah, I have a website, and it's www.blackbirdholistic.com. I have a Facebook page that's Blackbird Holistic. You can look that up. And then I'm also part of this new initiative, this Healing NL Association, and it's a conglomeration of alternative, complementary healing practitioners, and it's a directory, so you can find anybody on the island or the big land, and you can look me up there as Nancy Lieff.
Great. Nancy, great conversation. That's it for this week, folks. We'll be right back next week with another interesting guest.